Hello photography family, Todd Peak of Peak Photography, and I hope you're having a great day. Hey, welcome to part 2 of our exposure triangle series. Today, it's all about shutter speed. We're not going to waste any more time, we're going to jump right in, so come on, let's learn together. What is the shutter speed and how does it affect the image? The shutter inside the camera opens and closes at a high rate of speed. This allows light into the image to be captured on the sensor. The longer you leave the shutter open, the more light gets into the camera. The quicker the shutter speed, the lower amount of light that comes into the sensor, creating a darker image. Here's a great video example from the slow-mo guys. I don't know if you've ever seen their work before, but these guys are awesome. In this video, it shows in slow motion the shutter opening and then closing inside the camera. I'll put a link in the description below for this video. It's a great video. After you watch this video, go there and check it out. It's really, really good. So as we look at the shutter speed, I want to look at how we change the shutter speed on our camera. Now, all camera manufacturers are a little bit different in the way that it's done, the way that it changes, but pretty much they're all the same. It's going to appear as a fraction 1 over whatever the shutter speed is. So on this video, you can see it starting at 1 over 40 or a 40th of a second. And you can see here as we adjust it to a faster shutter speed, we're going to 1 over, say, 1,000th, so 1,000th of a second. That's going to be a much darker image. But then as we go to a much slower shutter speed, up to 3, 5, 10, 30 seconds, whatever it may be, that's going to let a lot more light into the image, creating a much brighter picture. This is the shutter speed and what it means to the effect of the exposure. In this video here, you can see that as I make the shutter speed faster, the image gets darker because we're letting less light into the image. But as I slow down the shutter speed, more light comes into the image, making it brighter. The more light you let into the image, the slower the shutter speed. So when we're looking at the shutter speed, we're not just looking at the exposure of the image. Shutter speed is critical into how sharp the image is. So let's take a look at several situations in which the shutter speed is going to determine the sharpness of the image. When doing portrait sessions, most of the time you're dealing with a subject that's not moving, or at least not moving very fast. The shutter speed is going to depend on whether you're hand holding the camera or if you're using a tripod. If you're hand holding the camera, there's a rule called the reciprocal rule. With the reciprocal rule, you take your focal length and you put your shutter speed at 1 over the focal length of the lens. For example, if you're shooting a 35mm lens, your speed, your shutter speed, would be a 40th of a second. If you're shooting a 50mm, it would be a 50th of a second, so on and so forth. Now, if you tend to have steady hands, this is a great starting point. But if you're like me and you don't hold the camera all that steady, you may want to double it. Especially if you're using a telephoto lens and you're zooming in and zooming out. Increasing the shutter speed to ensure that as you zoom in, you're still going to be able to get a sharp image is really important. Now, in choosing a shutter speed for portraits, it's important to get as much light into the image as possible. In this session, we were in 2 areas, the sanctuary and outside. In the sanctuary, it was pretty well lit, but I still had to keep the shutter speed fairly high to get a nice, sharp image. It helped that I was shooting with my aperture pretty low too, allowing a lot more light into the image as well. And of course, when we went outside, I had a lot of natural light. And it was kind of rainy outside, so the cloud cover made for a nice softbox. But when doing portraits, some put the shutter speed way too fast, just to make sure that they have a sharp image. But to me, that reduces the amount of light coming into the image and causes you to have to use a higher ISO than you might otherwise. Using higher ISO will introduce noise into the image. And for portraits, that's not good. So, if you're hand holding the camera for portraits, the reciprocal rule is your friend. And maybe, like me, double it. Using a tripod is one of the best ways to ensure that you won't get camera shake when doing a portrait session. You reduce the shutter speed, letting in more light into the camera, potentially allowing the ISO to be a lot lower, and still getting a much cleaner, sharper image. That's why when you go into portrait studios, you always see the cameras set up on a nice, steady tripod. So for getting the perfect shot when the subject isn't moving, a tripod is a must. Tripods are also critical when you're doing long shutter speeds. Long shutter speeds are used in nighttime or astrophotography, or when getting creative with light trails. I'll show you more about that in a minute. In this image, this was the super blood wolf moon eclipse from January 21st, 2019. This was shot at a shutter speed of 1 second. There would be no way that I could zoom in this far and keep the shot steady without a tripod. But because I had it mounted on a tripod, I was able to get this group of images from that night. But let's be honest, the blood moon eclipse is not why you're here. You want to see the sports shots and figure out how to freeze the action in these sometimes dimly lit areas. So come on, let's take a look at sports photography. In sports photography, trial and error is your friend. Over time, you'll get used to the general settings for certain situations. But when learning, get to the location early. Take a lot of test shots. Get a feel for the light that's in the room. Here's how I go about setting my shutter speed when shooting basketball. It can easily be one of the more difficult sports to shoot. Unless you're blessed enough to shoot an NCAA game or an NBA game, the chances of having a gymnasium with over 100 foot candles of light, it's pretty slim. I know when I'm going in to shoot basketball that my ISO is gonna have to be elevated. Now I don't want to take it too high because I don't want a lot of noise in the shot. But I know it's gonna have to be up from 100, so I always start somewhere around 1600. Now this likely won't be enough, but that's where I start. The lens I use to shoot basketball is a 70-200 f2.8 aperture lens. So I start with my f-stop wide open at 2.8, again, opening the aperture to get as much light in as possible. Then during warm-ups, I start playing with different shutter speeds, and I continue to increase the shutter speed and the ISO until I freeze the action. This image was shot at a shutter speed of 1,000th of a second. I was at ISO 6400 and an aperture at f3.2. You can see how the image is nice and sharp, but when I move the shutter speed to 1/40th of a second, this clearly was not fast enough to freeze the action. But because I'm letting so much more light into the image, I had to drop the ISO to 400 so the image would be exposed correctly and not way too bright. For this shot, again, I had a slow shutter speed, so the image was blurred. But moving the shutter speed up to 800th of a second, I was able to freeze this shot and keep my ISO at 6400 with the f-stop at 3.2. I was pleased with these images. I especially like this last one. Check him out. The coach got more air than the player. Nicely done, coach. So when it comes down to shooting basketball, just know that the ISO is going to have to be your friend, not your enemy. Now, can you overdo it? Oh yeah, absolutely you can. But to freeze the action and have a nice sharp image, it's about all you can do. Of course, all gymnasiums are going to be lit differently, so be sure to get there in plenty of time to try out some different settings. But I always like to start with my ISO as low as possible and then work my way up to get a nice, sharp, clean image. Now my favorite sport to shoot is tennis. 9 times out of 10, you're gonna have all the light you need. I think when I shot these two images, I was at a 5,000th of a second shutter speed. The challenge in tennis, at least for us here in Bristol, is that we're in a sporting complex and the tennis courts are inside fences. To get a good shot, you have to get the f-stop wide open, enough to make the fence disappear. And that's a trick we'll cover in the aperture tutorial coming up. Next, let's look at image blur. In my introduction video, I mentioned that sometimes shutter speed is used to intentionally create motion blur in an image. Here are a few times when that is the case. Sticking with the sports theme, I'd like to feature some images from my friend and fellow photographer, John Monroe of 151 Photography. For shooting NASCAR, you definitely want to show movement in the image. You don't want to freeze the shot with such a high shutter speed that the cars just look like they're parked on the track. Check these pictures out. John uses a technique called panning. He's got the shutter speed high enough to get a good clean shot, but as the cars are passing by, he's following the cars with his camera. He's panning across the plane. This gives him the blur of the wall and the stands while keeping the car in focus. The true mastery of these shots, it's in the wheels. John's got this panning so perfectly dialed in that he's got the motion blur on the walls, the stands, but notice the tires. You can clearly see the movement in the tires. That's the money shot. But the car, it's nice and sharp. John, great work, man. These are awesome. Look, this one's one of my favorites. This one, it's the opposite. He nailed the focus on the wall, the stands, and the track. And the cars, they're just enough out of focus to know which car is which, but not so out of focus that you can't even tell it's a car. Go check out John's work. I'll link his information below as well. John will be joining us on locations in the future, so you'll get to meet him as well. A few more of the non-sport focused reasons to create motion blur. These are pretty cool. This pool is on the Carnival Sunshine cruise ship. The waterfall on it is beautiful. But if you freeze the image, it just doesn't have the same effect as showing the movement of the waterfall. So this image was shot at a 20th of a second, and it was beautiful. One of the really fun things to do with shutter speed is creating light trails. This is the historic Paramount Theater here in Bristol, Tennessee. I wanted to get a sharp image of the sign in downtown area while getting light trails from the cars going past in the street. With this image, I began at an 80th of a second shutter speed. You can clearly see that it pretty much stopped the car driving in the street. Not exactly what I was going for. But dropping it to a 40th of a second, you can kind of see the car begin to blur, so I knew I was headed the right direction. When I dropped the exposure all the way down to 4 seconds, now we were getting somewhere. From there, I'd just dial in the settings to get what I really wanted. My favorite of the night was this one. It was at a 10-second exposure time. The ISO at 64 and the aperture at f11. Then turning the other way, I got the iconic Bristol sign. I just had to get this one using the same technique. This one, it was shot at 8 seconds, ISO 64, and an aperture of f11. These examples are primarily to show you that shutter speed is not just used to freeze motion. Sometimes you want to show the movement to enhance the image. It's important to use the shutter speed not only to freeze the image, but to be creative. Create motion in the images. It creates a much more dynamic picture. Now, as we discussed in last week's episode, and I've mentioned it again today, when you adjust the shutter speed, you're either letting in more light or you're getting less light. To make sure the image is exposed correctly, you have to adjust the aperture and/or the ISO. So stick with me to the final video in this series on the exposure triangle, and we'll get into a lot more detail of how these work together and how you can feel confident changing your dials, not just guess. Next week, we're going to dig into ISO. What is it? How does it affect my image? And how can I use it to make my pictures better? Listen, I hope you've learned something from today's video. If you have, be sure to smash the like button and subscribe for more weekly content. Hit the bell icon to be notified when new tutorials drop, and comment below if there's something you'd like for us to cover in this series. Now, for the most important part of the night, grab your camera, Go out there and take some pictures. Thanks for watching, and as always, I'll see you in the next video.